Thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from June 2nd, 2019. Join us as we continue our study on the life of Joseph with Pastor Dax.
You've probably seen scenes like this on the news or in a movie. A kidnapped daughter who is rescued and returned to heartsick parents. A comatose husband who suddenly wakes and grasps the hand of his anxious wife. A soldier thought to have been killed in action who appears on the doorstep of his mother's house. Real-life moments of reunion and reconciliation, moments that are so powerful, so charged with emotion that words fail and only tears will suffice. This is the very thing we see in this passage here before us today. Beneath the surface level of the storyline is a dynamic of deep and diverse emotions that are suddenly awakened to life here as this family is forced to face the possibility of its own reconciliation. Does that seem like a strange way to put it? It makes the idea of reconciliation seem so painful and unpleasant. And that's because, in this case, it is. This is no fairy tale. In this family, Joseph's family, there has been unimaginable jealousy and hatred. There has been outright betrayal and abandonment. There has been physical abuse and violence. And then to cover all of that up, there has been, at this point, 20 years of ongoing deception and hypocrisy. All of which means that now there are bills coming due. There are consequences that need to be reckoned with. There are deep-seated wounds which need to be healed. And that means that the path to reconciliation for this family, if it's even possible at all, is going to come at a very high price. And this chapter 42, unfolds in three scenes. Very simply, in verses 1 through 5, the brothers leave for Egypt. In verses 6 through 26, they attempt to do business in Egypt. And in verses 27 through 38, they return home from Egypt. But it's not the structure of the chapter that interests me as much as what is revealed about the people in the story. What does this chapter tell us about Joseph's father, Jacob? What does it tell us about Joseph's 10 brothers? What does it tell us about Joseph? What does it tell us about ourselves? And what does this chapter reveal about the possibility of reconciliation? And what we're going to learn this morning, this is the big idea, is that it is only God's transforming grace that can overcome the terror of grief and the trauma of guilt. Only God's transforming grace can overcome the terror of grief and the trauma of guilt. So let's dive in here. Let's look at verse 1. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you look at one another?" So what's the problem here? Well, if we go back to the previous chapter, just a few verses, chapter 41, verse 53, it says, "The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said." In fact, look at the very last phrase there at the bottom, verse 57, "The famine was severe over all the earth." So there's a famine in the land, right? And that is a reality that becomes more pressing with each passing day. Ever shrinking portions with each meal. Children whimpering in their beds with hunger pangs. You know what this looks like, right? You've seen the images on TV before of drought and famine. People die in famine. Which is why Jacob is perplexed at the apparent immobility of his sons. "Why do you look at one another?" he says. And he said, Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. And you know what? I'm sure the brothers had heard the same thing. Everyone had heard that. This wasn't news. If you look again at chapter 41, verse 57, it says, moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain. Everybody knew that's where the grain was. So why are these brothers sitting around twiddling their thumbs? Why the hesitation? They know the need. They can feel it in their bellies. They know where the food is. So why sit around and do nothing? And I think it's possible because at all costs, they don't want to go near Egypt. They have a past association with Egypt that has haunted them every day for the last 20 years. Egypt, no thanks. They know that the provision is there, but they are paralyzed by their own guilt. But their father, Jacob, is still the revered patriarch of the family, and he gives them the word to go, and they know that if they don't go, their families are going to perish without food. So when Jacob says, go down and buy grain for us there that we may live and not die, that's exactly what they do. Verse 3, so 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. Why 10? Why 10 of the brothers? Well, for one thing, there's safety in numbers. It's a long journey. But they need 10 men, each with their own beast of burden, to bring back enough food to sustain the entire clan of 70 plus people. But notice there, with sending 10 brothers, there's 2 people who don't make the trip, right? One is Jacob himself. He's too old, frankly. And the other, verse 4, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Now, what exactly is he afraid of here at this point? This Benjamin is no longer a boy. He's well over age 20 by this point. Perhaps Jacob can recall freshly the experience of sending Joseph away for a few days and never seeing him again. And what Joseph once was, the favored son, Benjamin had now become. And Jacob's not going to risk that kind of pain again. But keep in mind, it's been 20 years, right? Not 6 months ago. 20 years. His whole life has become defined by the deception of his sons. And they know it. But they can't say anything about it. They're never going to come clean to their father, and as time passes, that guilt inside of them just eats away like a cancer. And what it means for their father is that he lives out his existence in fear. So we have one father terrified by grief. We have 10 brothers traumatized by guilt. And yet off they go. Verse 5, thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Right? So they had no other choice here. No other choice because of the famine, right? Yeah, but not just because of the famine. Think bigger. Think higher. Who's been the unseen player throughout this whole story? Who ordained the famine? God is driving them to Egypt. Why? Verse 6. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. He's the prime minister of Egypt, and his chief responsibility is to oversee this famine relief effort, which makes what happens next fascinating here. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them. Now that's understandable, right? After all, they're in the dazzling courts of Egypt here. How could you miss them? They stick out like a sore thumb. A bunch of dusty, tired, middle-aged shepherds from Canaan. And I imagine, though, that as soon as Joseph saw them, his heart just began to race in his chest. This tsunami of emotions welled up inside of him. And from a distance, he thinks to himself, well, their beards are a little grayer. The lines are a little deeper in their faces, but I'm sure that's them. And then like parents of large families do, he probably counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10. Only 10? Watch what happens next. But he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from? He said. They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. Simple enough. But notice, and Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Why not? Well, for one thing, it's been 20 years, right? If you've ever been to your 20th high school reunion, you've experienced something of this phenomenon. But I would remind you, too, that Joseph is now clean-shaven, probably including his head being shaved. He's dressed in the garb of Egyptian royalty. He's speaking Egyptian through an interpreter to them, and his name tag says Zaphanath-Paneah. How could they have known it was him? Not to mention, they probably assumed that Joseph was long since dead, right? I mean, who survives 20 years in hard slavery? And even if they thought he was alive, they would never expect to encounter him in this sort of setting. I mean, maybe in a refugee camp or maybe on a chain gang making bricks for the pyramids or something like that, but not this. They have no clue who he is, but Joseph knows exactly who they are. In fact, the key to this whole chapter is right here in verse 9. Verse 9 is the key. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. He remembered. And he said to them, still speaking roughly, you are spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land. They said to him, no, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies. Now, they may have been murderers and kidnappers and adulterers and liars, but certainly they'd never spied. They're honest men. He said to them, no, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see. And they said, we, your servants, are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more. And of course, the irony here is that Mr. No More is standing right in front of them, right? But Joseph said to them, it is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you, and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. And he put them all together in custody for 3 days. The obvious question is why is Joseph doing this? Why is he acting in this way? It seems on the surface to be so vindictive, so vengeful. We'll get into that more in the next couple of weeks. But look at verse 18. On the third day, so after 3 days of letting him sit and stew in prison, on the third day Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die. In other words, Joseph's raised the stakes here. Their very lives now are at the mercy of his demand. And they did so. I mean, they get the point, right? But they need to choose which one of them is going to remain in this Egyptian prison while the rest of them beat feet back to Canaan, hopefully to talk their terrified father into allowing their youngest brother to go with them. But does all of this have a familiar ring to it here, what's happening? The idea of these brothers being put in a situation where they have to abandon one of their brothers, sort of reminiscent of a shameful wrongdoing from their past that's been carefully concealed and covered up for 20 years. Joseph's very intentional and deliberate in what he says and what he does here. He has a purpose, and now the top of this thing has been popped off, And what had been bottled down for 2 decades now just comes exploding to the surface. Verse 21. Then they said to one another, "In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen." Remember that back in chapter 37? They sat down and had a nice lunch while their brother cried out to them from the pit. And look at the connection they make. That is why this distress has come upon us. Interesting. They hadn't spoken about this in 20 years, at least not openly. And their lives had been miserable because of it. They'd sold Joseph into slavery all those years ago, but that was not the end of their sin. Because sin tends to compound and grow exponentially. In order to hide their sin, they had to deceive their father. And now their father has lived in a terrified state of grief for 2 decades. They could see it on his face every day. And it wore on them, I'm sure. It broke their hearts. And undoubtedly, it poisoned their relationships with each other, too. Guilt does that. Every single day lived with guilt makes a person suspicious. Always wondering, did he tell? Will he keep his mouth shut? What are those two always whispering about? And now, seemingly, there's a punishment that fits that crime. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a brother for a brother, a distress for a distress. In truth, we are guilty concerning our brother in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. We were the cause of Joseph's distress, and now it's coming back on our own heads. Friends, this is a truth that you need to know. That buried guilt never remains buried. Unrepentant guilt will not leave you alone. You can sear your conscience for a while, but eventually it will rise to the surface. It will visit you in your dreams if you won't deal with it in your waking hours. Unrepentant guilt will change you. It will alter your personality. It will steal your joy. It will eat you up from the inside out until you deal with it and make it right. And haunting these brothers in their nightmares for the last 20 years were the screams and pleas of their brother Joseph, begging them not to kill him, begging them not to throw him in the pit, begging them not to sell him to the Ishmaelites. And now they're like the hit-and-run driver who manages to flee the scene but never forgets the thud of the body against the car. And Reuben answered, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood." You see how this is just a volcano of guilt erupting here. It reminds me of this little illustration I came across of a police officer directing traffic at sunset, and it's so bright he's squinting in the direction of the oncoming traffic, and one of the drivers misinterprets his squint for a scowl, and he pulls over, rolls down the window, and says, "I did it," referring to the car that he'd just stolen. And he turns himself in. That's what guilt had done to these brothers. Right? We've been caught is what they're thinking. No one else knows that we've been caught, but we know we've been caught. But someone else did know, didn't they? Verse 23, they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. They assumed that he didn't speak their language, but he was listening to every word. Which is why he turned away from them and wept. Because he's just learned right now, for the very first time, that his brother Reuben, regardless of his motives, had tried to save his life. And that these brothers, quite obviously, are still dealing with the guilt of their sin against him all these years later. And this is not the last time that Joseph will have to excuse himself because of his emotions. And of course, the brothers themselves are emotional too. And as they relive those shameful moments and cast fresh blame on each other, Joseph is moving. It says, and he returned to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. They were supposed to choose one of the brothers. Instead, the accusations fly, the guilt gets piled on, and Joseph chooses for them. 10 guys to choose from, and he picks Simeon, which is no big deal, right? Just one brother is just as good as any brother. But I don't think it's an accident that Joseph chooses Simeon, the second born of Leah, to be held in trust for Benjamin, the second born of Rachel. Now, did they make that connection? I think they probably did, because their guilt has made them so hypersensitive that they are operating with a new sense of awareness. They are connecting dots all over the place that never were meant to be connected. What do I mean? Well, look at verse 25. And Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to replace every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. Then they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw his money in the mouth of his sack. He said to his brothers, my money has been put back. Here it is in the mouth of my sack. Now notice, they don't accuse this unnamed brother of theft because they know he didn't steal the money. And yet, the very next line says, at this their hearts failed them. Why? Well, they're returning home as quickly as possible to retrieve Benjamin so they can return and prove that they're not spies. But if they go back, now they'll also have to defend themselves against the charge of being thieves. But they're not thieves. They didn't do it. So why panic? It's a simple misunderstanding, right? They're innocent. Well, they're innocent of stealing the money. They're not innocent of selling Joseph into slavery for 20 shekels of silver, but those are two separate issues, right? Those are unrelated. It's irrational to try to connect those. Exactly. This is what unrepented of guilt does. And look at what they say. They turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? This is the first time the brothers mention God in the whole story. And I find it interesting that their first mention of God comes so close in connection with their confession of sin. Slowly but surely here, they are starting to come to grips with God and his providential working in their lives. Now, because of their guilt, though, they can't see things for what it really is. They can't experience the joy and the blessing of the money being put back into their sacks, because the very idea of being blessed like that is so incongruent with their unrepentant sin and guilt. On the other hand, an innocent person wouldn't necessarily assume the worst, right? But it's a different story with these brothers. A 2 decades old, shameful secret has been freshly exposed, and now their guilt becomes the grid through which they're going to interpret everything that happens to them. This is true, I think, isn't it? A guilty person is always looking over his shoulder. And I'm sure that this was not a pleasant trip home for these guys. Verse 29. When they came to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, and that extends all the way through verse 34. That's just a recap of the interaction. We've heard that read to us already. And though Jacob is already frightened, he's undoubtedly grieved by what he hears with this news of Simeon, he has no reason not to believe them, no reason to call into question the integrity of their story. That is, until they open their packs. Verse 35. As they emptied their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. Notice, and when they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob, their father, said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin, all this has come against me. See, it's the sight of the money in their bags that triggers this outburst from Jacob. Why? Well, even though it's been 20 years, it feels like yesterday. Jacob, I'm sure, remembers another time when his sons left home and came back minus a brother, but with extra silver in their pockets. And now, if the thought ever crossed his mind, he hadn't allowed himself to go there. Not that we're told, but now here with what seems to be sort of a sick replay of the same event from so long ago, Jacob effectively says, what kind of fool do you take me to be? Simeon can stay there. When this food runs out, we can starve. I'm not going to give up Benjamin. Now, in this case, he uses some circumstantial evidence, the money in the bags, to arrive at the wrong conclusion. But can you blame him? I mean, he has been terrified by the grief caused by the sins of his sons. And they know that they're the cause of it. They know it. Which is why I think Reuben responds so impulsively in verse 37. Then Reuben said to his father, "Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands and I will bring him back to you." But Jacob said, "My son," notice, not your brother, "my son shall not go down with you, for his brother," again, not your brother, "his brother is dead, and he is the only one left." Wow. That tells you something of what Jacob feels about his other 10 sons, doesn't it? If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. End of the chapter. And if you're uncomfortable with unresolved tension, this is not a pleasant place to end. Joseph is still alienated from his brothers. Simeon is in prison, cut off from his family. These brothers are hurling accusations at each other. The rift between Jacob and the brothers now seems irreparable. And they all lived happily ever after, right? But again, the Bible is not a fairy tale. It's not fantasy. It reminds us again and again that sin always has severe consequences, even consequences that may last a lifetime, which means that the path to reconciliation then will always be difficult. Is it even possible at all? Let's think about the characters in this story. Jacob, terrified by grief. The 10 brothers, traumatized by guilt. And what are we to make of Joseph? Speaking harshly to his brothers, refusing to reveal himself to them, playing some sort of mind game, accusing them of being spies, which he knows isn't true, putting them all in prison for 3 days, keeping Simeon there while he sends the rest back for who knows how long that lasts. What's he doing? What's this all about? Well, I told you earlier that the key to making sense of this entire chapter lies in verse 9. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them. Those 2 dreams from back in chapter 37, remember? Remember the first dream? It was those 10 sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf of grain. A picture of his brothers acknowledging his superior position, which is precisely what happened, right? We saw it in this chapter in verse 6. When Joseph was governor over the land, he was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. It was the fulfillment of the first dream. But there wasn't just one dream. There was a second dream. Remember? Where the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to Joseph, his father, his mother, and 11 brothers. But on this day, he's only counted 10. And if the details of the dream sent by God are to be believed, then that moment hasn't happened yet. So what's going on here? Well, remember last week what we looked at when Pharaoh had a dream, and then based on the facts of that dream, Joseph devises this strategy to save Egypt? Same thing here. God gave Joseph a dream when he was 17 years old in which his entire family is together in some sort of setting that they acknowledge his superiority. And now, based on his trust in the facts of that dream, Joseph devises another strategy to bring his family together. That's what this is all about. Him getting them there. Saving his family by the means of the power that God's providence had granted him in the position that he's in. And I think that this was Joseph's strategy that he devised long before these guys ever even showed up. Joseph knew the extent of the famine, that it extended into the land of Canaan, which means he knew eventually his family would have to come to Egypt to get grain. He knew they'd come. And he had a plan. But part of that plan involves him not letting his guard down prematurely. He still has to wear the mask, or else these brothers are going to bolt for the door. Why? We've already seen it, haven't we? They know they're guilty. Guilt has consumed them. Guilt is the grid through which they're interpreting everything, and so they have no capability to imagine a scenario in which Joseph would ever forgive them for what they'd done. Moreover, as we'll see in the next couple of weeks too, Joseph has a responsibility to determine and discern whether or not these brothers have changed at all in the last 20 years. So he has to maintain the ruse, right? That's the reason for the harshness. That's the reason for the 3 days in prison. They have to believe that he really means what he says and that he thinks they're spies. They've got to be convinced that if they don't release Simeon, that he's not going to release Simeon until they bring Benjamin. All of this plan is for the sake of the dream and for the reconciliation of his family. And sometimes you'll read in the commentaries and hear that Joseph is acting vindictively, vengefully here, getting a little bit of payback. I don't see it. I see a man who hears his brother's guilt, and then he weeps with such emotion he has to leave the room to compose himself, like I need to. I see a man who, as a gesture of kindness, he puts money into the sacks of his brothers, not rocks, to mock them. I see a man who, instead of keeping 9 brothers in prison, keeps 1, so that the rest can take food back to the family so they don't starve. I see a man who so believes God's revelation to him that he's willing to, for a short while, make decisions that are going to hurt those that he loves for the sake of a far greater good. Vindictive? No, I don't see it. We have Jacob terrified by grief, the brothers traumatized by guilt. Joseph, on the other hand, has been transformed by grace. And it's because he's been transformed by grace that he can now dispense grace to his family. Joseph is the only hope for this family's reconciliation. Only Joseph's actions will ever be able to silence the haunting cries of that guilt. Nothing else is going to do it. And so the question I want to ask you is, are you guilty? And it's a trick question because I know the answer already. Yeah, you are. As am I, right? We all are because we are human beings. The real question is, how are you dealing with your guilt? How are you coping with it? Immersing yourself in work? Distracting yourself with life's pleasures? Exhausting yourself in activities? Opting for a pill or a drink or a therapist? Hiding? Denying? Running? deceiving. Aren't you tired of that? Aren't you weary of that? Don't you want to be rid of that once and for all? There is a solution to the universal dilemma of human guilt. Because there is a man far greater than Joseph who extends a much greater grace to the very people who have sinned against him. His name is Jesus Christ. And he is the one who alone can put to death forever your guilt that will only keep coming back to life if you try to deal with it in any other way. The grace offered through Jesus Christ is the only solution for your guilt. The grace offered through Jesus Christ is the only way you can be transformed. Jesus Christ is your only hope that reconciliation with God is possible. And so if you never have, you must come to him. You have to lay your sin down at the cross, trust in Jesus' finished work there, and he will put your guilt to death once and for all. It's only God's transforming grace that overcomes the terror of grief and the trauma of guilt. So come to him.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.